Leuk hoor. Gaat u alsjeblieft zitten. Allemaal hartelijk welkom op de doctoraatsverdediging van de heer Pieter Robyns. Vooraleer we beginnen ga ik u even de jury voorstellen. En ik ga beginnen aan het vers van mij, zo naar mij toe werken. Dan hebben we professor Guevara Robyns van Northeastern University in de Verenigde Staten. Vervolgens Dr. Matti van Hoef van de New York University in Abu Dhabi. Vervolgens hebben we dan professor Mathieu Conche van INSA Lyon in Frankrijk. Dan hebben we Dr. Dave Singelet van de KU Leuven. En de volgende mensen zijn dan het eigen huis, professor Chris Luiten, professor Pieter, de co-promotor, professor Wim Lamotte, de promotor, en ikzelf ben Mark Gijs. En ik ga naar best vermogen proberen deze zitting in goede banen te leiden. En een goede eerste stap in die zaak, mocht u dat nog niet gedaan hebben, zou ik u willen vragen van uw gsm af te zetten of tenminste op stil te zetten. En dan geef ik nu graag het woord aan de heer Pieter Robyns om zijn proefschrift aan ons voor te stellen in ongeveer 40 à 45 minuten.
Dank u wel. Beste leden van de jury, beste vrienden en familie, beste collega's en ook beste studenten. Ik denk dat jullie zo voltallig aanwezig zijn op de verdediging van mijn doctoraat genaamd Explicit and Implicit Information Leakage in Wireless Communication. Nu, omdat we ook met een aantal buitenlandse juryleden zitten, ga ik de presentatie in het Engels houden, hopelijk is dat voor jullie geen probleem. So, dear members of the jury, dear family and friends, dear colleagues and dear students, welcome to my PhD defense, which is titled Explicit and Implicit Information Leakage in Wireless Communication. Now, when looking at this title, some of you might be wondering, what do all these words mean? And why did I spend all my tax money on this? So, to start off, I wanted to start with a little example. Suppose we want to connect to some service on the internet, and we all know Instagram, a very popular website online. Well, the first thing you would do is, of course, purchase an access point somewhere. And in order to then connect to the internet, you need to purchase a subscription with a ISP, for example. And two popular ISPs in Belgium are Proximus and Telenet. But what you can also do is just connect to an open network, such as the ones that you find at McDonald's or Starbucks, or any open Wi-Fi hotspot available. Now, besides those access points, we also need a device to actually connect to them and to use our browser to surf to Instagram. And so people use smartphones, laptops, or perhaps even Internet of Things sensors like temperature sensors. Now, you wouldn't use a temperature sensor to connect to Instagram, of course, but you get the idea. Now, what you also don't want is to walk around with an Ethernet cable strapped to your back the whole time. So what people invented is wireless communication in order to talk to this access point. And the most popular wireless protocol nowadays is undoubtedly Wi-Fi, but there are other wireless protocols out there as well, such as Bluetooth, for example, when communicating with a smartwatch, or LoRa, which is used for Internet of Things sensors. Now, in an ideal world, this would be perfect because we can communicate with our services and everything is fine. But in reality, there are some bad people like me, for example, who will try to attack this system. And they can do that in various ways. One approach would be to attack the service directly. In this case, I could try to deface Instagram, change the web page, and in that way extract some information from people that visit Instagram. What I could also do is look at the network traffic that's passing between the access point and Instagram itself, or between the smartphone and Instagram itself over the wire. In this case, we're talking about network security related stuff. And finally, I could also wear a ski mask, break into your house, and then steal your sensor or smartphone, and then offline perform some kind of attack to read memory or whatever. And this is called physical security, which is also very important for companies like certificate authorities who need to hand out certificates for websites. But in this presentation, we'll talk about none of that. In fact, we'll focus on this part of the communication here, which is the part between the smartphone and an access point, which is wireless communication. And just to show you that wireless communication and wireless security is still a very hot topic today, I looked around for some news articles and I found, even in this year, a lot of examples. For example, here you have an Amazon Ring, which is a kind of doorbell that accidentally leaks Wi-Fi passwords to attackers. We have medical devices that contain Wi-Fi vulnerabilities, cars that get hijacked using wireless vulnerabilities, and the list goes on. Finally, there's also the aspect of privacy, which should also be considered. For example, in this instance, a train company wants to track travelers by using their smartphone devices, so the radiation that they emit. All right, so let's take a look at a simple example of communication between a smartphone and an open access point. Well, the first thing that will happen is the smartphone will passively receive frames that are called, messages that are called beacon frames. And those beacon frames essentially announce the presence of a certain access point. In this case, the network name is OpenNet. So if you look into your list of networks, you will see a network named OpenNet appear. What the smartphone can also do is they can initiate this scan themselves in case you don't want to constantly passively listen for messages. And here the smartphone sends a probe request to the access point, to which it will respond with a probe response. After that, some more messages are exchanged, and then in the end, we can communicate with the access point as desired. In this dissertation, I have considered two types of adversaries that can interfere in this process. We have one type of adversary that can inject new frames into the communication, or listen to new or capture information from those frames. And we have another adversary who will listen to the side effects of this communication, but we'll come back to that later on in the presentation. So in the thesis, I discovered a number of vulnerabilities and flaws in protocols, and I've made a distinction between two different types of them. The first type is called explicit information leakage. And with this, I mean information leakage in messages in the physical or in the data link layer, so layer 1 or layer 2. And these are typically caused by flaws in the protocol design or implementation itself. Then there is also implicit information leakage, which is information leakage from side effects during the execution of the protocols and not the protocol messages themselves. And they are caused rather by the hardware or software implementation flaws. And these are inherently present, but they can be mitigated by a clever defender. So for now, let's focus on explicit information leakage. And my first step into the academic world really was in 2014 at YSEC in Oxford, where we worked on this paper called Exploiting WPA2 Enterprise Vendor Implementation Weaknesses Through Challenge Response Oracles. Now, what does this mean? Well, if you look at your own phone now and you go to your list of networks, you can click on EDM Secured and you can try to authenticate with that network. But as you will see, there are a number of credentials that you have to provide first. For example, you have to provide a username in the identity fields, and you have to provide a password. Of course, if you don't know the username and password, you cannot authenticate, and you cannot connect to the network. And this is called WPA2 Enterprise. It's an authentication protocol used in Wi-Fi networks for organizations, such as this one. And the reason why they do this is because if you compare it to your Wi-Fi network at home, where you only have a single password, then it could be that people will give it to other people, or if you have to fire an employee. So that's not what you want in an organization. There you want to revoke credentials once an employee doesn't work there anymore. And that's why WPA2 Enterprise is very popular in these use cases. So the actual authentication under the hood is performed using so-called EAP methods. And there are a large variety of EAP methods available. One is EAP GTC, you have EAP MSChatv2, LEAP, PEEP, and so on. And PEEP is one example that is commonly deployed and considered secure. So what we did then is we performed research on the security of those protocols and checked to see if they really are as secure as thought. In other words, we question, can we gain access to the network without having a username or password, even when using those secure EAP methods? Right, so let's look now at how PEEP usually happens. So we have a smartphone that wants to connect to a certain network. The network will ask us to perform PEEP as the first step. Then we'll set up a TLS tunnel, which means that any subsequent messages will be encrypted, similar to what happens if you go to an encrypted website. Then there is a challenge from the corporate net in this case. And a challenge can be compared to what happens if you use an authenticator device for your online banking. Then you also get a challenge from your banking website. You have to provide your PIN number, you have to insert your card. And all this information combined can be used to generate a challenge response, which in this case essentially proves that you know the user's password. In the end, the network itself will also respond to the challenge response, because we also need to prove that this network knows the user's password as well. So authentication goes in both ways. And after that, we have a successful authentication and the four-way handshake can begin, which means we can start exchanging encrypted data. Now, one observation that we make is that devices support multiple EAP methods. Why is that? Well, mainly because of compatibility issues. If you have a very old access point, you still want to be able to connect to that access point. So that's why multiple EAP methods are supported. And if the security of newer methods improves, they will be added to the list. But some EAP methods that are supported remain weaker than others. Especially what we also found is that Apple devices allow the authentication server to determine which EAP methods should be used. And so that means, as an attacker, if we can impersonate the access point, we can downgrade to a weaker authentication method. In this case, we can downgrade to LEAP, for example. So the first contribution of this thesis is that we demonstrate how this flow allows attacker to log into the network without having any username or passwords. And the way this happens is like this. So as usual, when we want to connect to an access point, it will ask us to perform PEEP. But in the meantime, what an attacker can do is they can set up their own network with the same name as the corporate net here, which means that any devices in the vicinity that want to connect to us can do so. And in this example, there is one Apple device that we managed to associate with. Then the access point will send an EAP request for LEAP instead of PEEP. And the result is that we, in the meantime, set up a TLS tunnel. We get the challenge from the corporate net as usual. But then we found that this challenge can, in fact, be converted to a LEAP challenge. Now, because the smartphone doesn't see anything out of the ordinary, it will just respond with its LEAP challenge response. And then we discovered that this challenge response can essentially be relayed back to the original network. And so, from perspective of this network's view, they will think that we actually know the password of the user. So they will be happy to respond with a challenge response. We cannot check this message, but that doesn't matter because we are already authenticated to the network. And since the session keys are derived from the TLS tunnel, we can just start sending data to the network. So obviously, this is really bad because this means that even though we have a WPA2 enterprise secured network, because of the fact that there's one Apple device with an outdated software on the network, means that we can just authenticate, and it's like this is an open network, basically. So, and to prevent this, we suggested 5 methods for mitigating this issue. And in the end, we also reported this vulnerability to Apple, and they fix it then in the following releases. So if you buy an Apple device now, you will see that LEAP is disabled by default, and that's because of this vulnerability. Maybe another funny thing to mention is that when they announced that the vulnerability was found, they said that an attacker can capture the MSChatv1 hash and then break it. But in practice, this turns out to be not even necessary. So they try to downplay the vulnerability a little bit so that it seems less bad than it actually is. All right. So inspired by this positive result, we went on to investigate whether there are more vulnerabilities to be found in Wi-Fi. And this resulted in a second publication at WISEC 2015 in New York City. And this paper is titled Injection Attacks on .11n MacFrame Aggregation. So as some of you might know, Wi-Fi is based on the IEEE 802.11 standard, which is basically a 3,000-page document that details all the possible messages that Wi-Fi devices can send to each other. Now, because consumers, they want higher data rates over time, they want new features over time, they want better security. So what happens is new amendments will be added to the standard in the future and have done so in the past. And one of those standards was .11n, which was introduced in 2009. And it's now supported by the majority of Wi-Fi devices produced today. So if you buy a Wi-Fi device today and you see this label, that means that your device supports .11n. Now, one of the features that this standard introduces is MAC layer frame aggregation. And what we show in this paper is that there's an issue with the aggregation mechanism that allows attackers to inject arbitrary frames. So how does frame aggregation work? Let's take a look at that. Normally, when you send a Wi-Fi frame, you have a number of headers that are being prepended to the frame. For example, this is a header that sits between the physical and the MAC layer. And also between successive frames, you have a short time where there cannot be any data on the air, which is the short interframe space. Now, if we have a lot of data to send, this means that there will be a lot of overhead, because each time you have to send a packet, there will be a PLCP header that is appended, and there will be some space between frames. So one solution that they came up with to improve the performance of this is to embed multiple MAC layer frames inside of one physical layer frame. And those are the AMPDU subframes you see here. The actual data that these frames transport is contained within the MPDU. And in order to detect whether there are multiple subframes in a single frame, the algorithm or the Wi-Fi device will look for the AMPDU delimiter. This contains a magic byte that will be used to detect the delimiter itself. It contains the length of the MAC layer packet and also a CRC to check whether there were any transmission errors. Now, if you look at the standard and read how the normal frame deaggregation mechanism works, you can see the following. So when a receiver receives an aggregated frame, what it will do is it will skip forward 4 octets and then check whether a new location contains a valid MPDU delimiter. And if so, it will unpack it. If not, it will continue searching until a valid delimiter is found or until the end of the frame is reached. Now, there's an interesting footnote in the standard as well. Occasionally, it will happen that there will be a wrong random bit pattern as a valid delimiter, because by coincidence, the CRC is correct, for example. And when this happens, the Mac will attempt to interpret a random MPDU. But they say this is not an issue because overall, this packet will just be dropped and there will be no further consequences, and it happens very rarely. But what happens is, if the attacker knows that this is happening in the background, he can craft a payload that contains a valid MPDU, and so this can be exploited in the end. Also, because AMPDUs are unpacked in hardware, this happens completely transparently, and for example, you cannot observe this in Wireshark if you would check it out. So let's take a look at this aggregated frame as an example. Here we have multiple subframes that are embedded inside of the aggregate frame. And as usual, the algorithm will look for the delimiter here and determine the subframe bounds. To do that, it will look for this magic byte. So what happens if there is noise on the channel and this delimiter signature gets corrupted? Well, the algorithm will just continue searching inside of the payload. And this is a huge problem. For example, what we can do now is we can inject frames into open .11n networks over the internet. So even without having a real Wi-Fi device, we can start sending Wi-Fi frames to devices all over the globe. And an example that we give is remote beacon frame injection, which could be used to exploit, for example, some code on the device that is responsible for parsing the SSID. What the attacker does in this case is he will set up a web server and he will host some kind of web page or image. Then, when the smartphone requests this image, it will be transported over the internet, but in fact, the payload contains an embedded beacon frame. Now, when the access point transmits this embedded beacon frame inside a Wi-Fi frame, it could happen that the AMPDU delimiter gets corrupted, and in this case, the embedded beacon frame will be interpreted instead. To see what this looks like inside of Wireshark, we have here port 80, so we're downloading from a plaintext HTTP server, And here we can see something suspicious in the payload already, because we see the string injected SSID. We see some weird data coming before that, which is the AMPDU delimiter. And in the end, what happens when this frame gets corrupted? Well, we can see that the SSID, or the beacon frame rather, is injected as expected. So obviously, you don't want Chinese hackers all over the world to be able to hack your devices, so we decided to propose a number of defenses. And the best and perhaps easiest solution to that is just to encrypt the MPDU payloads, because then frames can still be corrupted, but the attacker cannot create a valid AMPDU delimiter anymore. Also, don't join open Wi-Fi networks, because there are more issues at hand than this one. So prefer encryption always. All right, so now we discussed two vulnerabilities or flaws that were more related to Wi-Fi security. But what about Wi-Fi privacy? This is also a big issue. And for that, we wrote an article in Security and Communication Networks. And the title of that article is Non-Cooperative MAC Layer Fingerprinting and Tracking of Mobile Devices. So if we take a look at another example of a communication between a smartphone and an access point, then we see that after this thing called a four-way handshake, we have encrypted data. But before this handshake takes place, there are also some messages that are exchanged that are not encrypted. So what does this mean? Well, the attacker can, of course, capture these messages and start performing an analysis on those. And one popular example that attackers can use to exploit this is fingerprinting and tracking on the MAC layer. What the attacker will do here is he will set up multiple access points at various locations. For example, one access point in Hasselt, one in Antwerp, one in Brussels, and one in Leuven. And then, especially older devices do this. If you have a device that is scanning for nearby devices, it will broadcast its unique MAC address. If we then sometime later see the same MAC address appear in Antwerp, then we know that this person probably went from Hasselt to Antwerp in some time. So the messages that are responsible for this leakage are probe requests. And as I said before, they are used to scan for nearby networks. The access point will respond with a probe response, but they also contain information elements to announce which standards and which capabilities this device supports. Now, would you think that it is possible to track devices in practice using this approach? Well, we decided to test this at Pukkelpop 2015. And in the end, to make sure that this data was used for a good purpose, we made sure that it was passed on to the police so they could monitor traffic flow. So this was really used for a good purpose rather than just trying to track people. And what we did is we set up several detectors, for example, one at the Ring in Hasselt, one in Kiewit, and then one around Zolder. What you can do then is whenever a car passes by that transmits its MAC address, for example, because of a phone that is in the car, we can measure the time it takes between two observations of that MAC address. And this can then in turn be used to calculate travel times. This is the example for Pukkelpop, and you can actually see the beginning of Pukkelpop here, where there is a peak in travel duration, and also at the end of the festival when parents can get their children. Now, what's also interesting is if we look at the minimum time it takes, this is around the purple line, and this purple line is the time calculated by Google, which means that even if we take this average over multiple noisy measurements, we still get a result that is very close to what Google predicts. So you can actually use this to track people. All right, so you might think this is really bad. So what do vendors do about this? Isn't there any countermeasure? And my answer is yes, there is. There are three countermeasures that I will discuss now, and one is MAC address randomization. What this does is, and basically every modern device does this now, is to use a random MAC address when scanning for nearby access points. And because the MAC address is random, it's very hard to make correlations between the different probe requests. Another thing is broadcast probe requests. So instead of probing for a specific network name, what we will do is we will not include the network name in this probe, and instead we will ask all nearby access points to respond. And finally, there is the decorrelation of frame transmissions, which means that if you send multiple frames, you want to make sure that your sequence number is reset and your scrambler seed is reset, because if not, an attacker could also use that to make correlations between multiple frame transmissions. So as a contribution, we demonstrate that despite all of these countermeasures, it's still possible to track people. And we do this by performing an analysis of the information contained within one probe request. We also show that it is possible to elicit more transmissions than usual from a device. And this could be useful for if you want to increase the time resolution of your tracking system. In fact, we did apply this at Pukkelpop to improve the time resolution because we're talking about cars which already transmit at a lower rate. So we want to make sure that we got as many transmissions as possible. But since we only have limited time, I will not discuss this further in the presentation. Right, so how do we exactly perform this analysis and bypass those countermeasures? Well, as I said before, inside of a probe request, there are so-called information elements which contain the capabilities that a device supports. That means if we have multiple different devices, it could be that one device is a little bit older, so it can support all the data rates. And in this case, we have the phone, which has different capabilities than the laptop. And so whenever there are differing bits between those two, we say that those bits are variable. What can also happen is if you send multiple probe requests over time, then some devices might change some bits over time. So in this case, the last byte changes, and this is the stability of a certain byte. And this is obviously not what you want for fingerprinting because you want your fingerprints to be the same over an extended duration. What we did then is we performed an analysis of all of these information elements in a short experiment here at the research lab. And what we discovered is that there's a lot of information, for example, in vendor-specific information elements, but those bits are also very stable, which is bad. On the other hand, you have the information element order, which is the order in which information elements are transmitted, which also contains a lot of variability, but it's very stable. So it's always the same in the implementation. Naturally, those bits that have high variability and high stability are the ones that we want to use for our fingerprint. And to test whether our fingerprinting technique works in practice, we deployed 8 trackers at the Glimpse Festival in 2015. As opposed to previous studies, this is a practical experiment on a large scale rather than a lab environment experiment where we were able to capture 28,048 unique devices. We also make use of only one probe request per tracker because of the aforementioned reason from the countermeasures. Now, for large sets of 1,000 to 10,000 devices, the fingerprinting uniqueness is 33%. And you might think, that's not that good. But the reality is that most access points don't support more devices than 250 devices. So if you take a more realistic set size of 50 to 100 devices, our fingerprint uniqueness reaches about 80%. Now, what can vendors do to mitigate this issue then? Well, MAC address randomization is still a good thing because we don't want devices to send out their real MAC address ever. And also, when you're associating with an access point, you also want to randomize your MAC address. Avoid probe requests that contain the SSID. This makes sense because if you have a unique SSID name, an attacker could also use that to fingerprint back to you. And of course, decorrelating transmissions such as resetting the sequence number. Now, a new proposal that we mentioned in the thesis is to defer information element transmissions. What this means is that during scanning, you don't want to give away all the information you have already. You could, for example, first communicate a basic set of capabilities that is shared among a large pool of devices. And then later on in the authentication phase, you could send all the protocols that you support in another information element. Now, you might think, well, I don't want to wait until vendors implement all of this. So how can you mitigate this issue yourself? Well, there's one very simple solution. Just throw your smartphone in the garbage bin. But seriously, what you could do is you could download an app that fully disables your Wi-Fi based on geolocation, for example. So if you are at home, then the Wi-Fi chip will be enabled. But if you leave your house, then you can just let the app disable your Wi-Fi chip. Some of the countermeasures mentioned before are already implemented by vendors. If you look at Android 10, you can set, when connecting to a network, to use a randomized MAC address, which is something that I would suggest always doing if you want to prevent getting tracked. All right, so thus far we have considered explicit information leakages, which are due to protocol flaws or design flaws. And now let's take a look at implicit information leakage, which is information that originates from side effects of the execution of a protocol, which is also caused by the hardware or software implementation. Now, these leakages are inherently present, but still we can mitigate them if the vendor is clever. Here we proposed two research papers, one at ACM-WISEC 2017 in Boston, and the other one at IoT BDS 2018. The first one is about fingerprinting the raw radio signal, and the second one is about developing a decoder that is capable, or that helps in doing that, rather. All right. So data and wireless messages is modulated onto radio waves, which means that if we have some small differences in the hardware of our device, then these radio waves will be different as well. And we can exploit this information to fingerprint devices, even if they send the same data. So even if we have two identical smartphone models that send exactly the same data, because of some small manufacturing errors, it could be that the signals differ. And when this is the case, the attacker can capture this information and perform an analysis on that. So even when your protocol is perfectly sound, you can still be tracked in this way. We applied this to LoRa, which is a common new protocol for long-range communications. And for example, LoRa is often used in temperature sensors and wind sensors or anything that is on a remote location. So that's very interesting to track as an attacker. Now, this work was done in collaboration with Edward Marien from KU Leuven. We identified a number of unique features in this LoRa signal using a USRP, which is a kind of radio that can be used to capture data from any frequency between 60 megahertz and 6 gigahertz. And we evaluated this approach on a set of 22 LoRa devices, which includes 3 different vendors. To recognize patterns in these different radio signals, we used some machine learning techniques, and we'll show in just a minute how this works exactly. Right, so this is what the test setup looks like. We have our trusted USRP, which can capture data from the air, and we have our identical devices that we wish to fingerprint. So each of these devices will send the same or random data, and based on that, we will try to fingerprint them. Now, before you can do this, it's important to mention that normally if you buy some Wi-Fi device, it will only pass raw data to you, so you can't really inspect what the signal looks like. So in order to capture the raw radio signal, we need to build a demodulator that can capture the physical layer of LoRa, essentially. And for that, we had to reverse engineer the LoRa physical layer because this is a closed implementation. We developed a custom decoding algorithm that allows us to preserve the frequency errors that are present in the device rather than correcting for them. And then we use those frequency errors to fingerprint devices. If you want to check out this implementation for yourself, feel free to check it out on GitHub. There's also a student in this audience who helped build this or make this more performant. So first, let's take a look now at what the signal features look like when you plot them in a visualization. Something that you should immediately see is that there are 3 groups here, and these groups correspond to the different vendors. So we see that if we have a different vendor, there's a lot of difference, in this case, between the frequency offset of these devices. And so we can use this frequency offset to fingerprint them. What you can also see is that even between devices from the same vendor, there are some subtle differences. And so the question is, can we learn based on those differences and try to classify those devices? If you visualize this in a 3D graph, each colored dot is a transmission from the same device. And you can see that the same colors are grouped together, which is again very encouraging because it means that there are definitely differences between multiple transmitters of the same model. So how do we go about fingerprinting in this case? Well, first, what we want to do is capture and synchronize to those LoRa signals. What we then did is split the signal into symbols so that we can perform our classification of each symbol separately. And this allows us, if we have multiple symbols, to do a kind of majority vote for the entire signal. After that, we go to signal processing, in which case we essentially perform a Fourier transform to extract the frequency components of the signal. And then we feed that to a neural network to train our model. This process is repeated a number of times. And in the end, when we are satisfied with the accuracy of our model, we can start fingerprinting unseen symbols, in which case if we, for example, receive 2 symbols from this device and 2 symbols from that device, we can predict whether it was LoRa device 1 or LoRa device 2. After training, this is what the 2D visualization looks like. Again, we can see 3 big clusters here, which correspond to the vendors. And if we look at the fingerprinting accuracy for individual devices, then this accuracy reaches from 59 to 99%. 59 depends on how long it took between the training phase and the testing phase. So when we are measuring what the signal of a certain device looks like, and we let a lot of time go between it, it could be that due to temperature changes in the room or due to other interferences, this fingerprint will transform over time, which will decrease the accuracy. But when those conditions are optimal, so if you fingerprint and then immediately after try to classify, we get a very high accuracy of up to 99%. For individual vendors, this is easier because those clusters are further apart in the feature space, so it's easier for the classifier to distinguish them. And for those, we managed to get 99 to 100% accuracy. All right, so that was one type of implicit information that is always present in a certain radio wave. But let's take a look at EM emissions from the CPU, and EM stands for electromagnetic in this case. This was published this year at the Conference on Cryptographic Hardware and Embedded Systems, and the paper was titled Improving CIMA Using Correlation Optimization. What many people don't know is that besides radio signals themselves, devices also transmit some electromagnetic radiation that originates from the hardware. And the question is, can we capture those electromagnetic emissions as well, and can we then exploit them? For example, again, after the 4-way handshake, there will be some exchange data that is encrypted. And if for this encryption AES is used, for example, can we use the leakage that comes from this device in order to determine the AES key? If so, we could be able to decrypt the data. To do this, again, we use our USRP, but instead of using an antenna, we use a specialized probe that can be placed above the CPU. Whenever the CPU performs calculations, we can capture its electromagnetic emissions and then perform statistical analysis on this radiation. And as a contribution, we show that protected AES implementations can be broken more efficiently using machine learning techniques on this electromagnetic radiation. For that, we use a dataset of publicly available electromagnetic traces, which is called ASCAT. And we also perform an experiment on a custom dataset of EM traces from an Arduino, which is a small Internet of Things device. So if you look at this waterfall plots right here, time is on the y-axis and the frequency is on the x-axis. So whenever the device is idle, you can see that there are some carriers present, and this can happen due to clock harmonics or other noise that is present in the circuit. But then when we perform our encryption operation, there is some change in the signal, which means that there could be some leakage that we can exploit. If we then look at the signal in the time domain, we can even distinguish multiple parts of the algorithm that are being executed. For example, when you're doing AES, the first thing you have to do is execute the AES init function, and we can see this function being executed here. After that, there will be an encryption function, which is taking place here, and you can count the individual rounds of AES. So that's 10 rounds, and those, and especially what's interesting is the first round of AES, because this is a weak point. To see why it is weak, let's take a look at the AES design document. So if we look at where the key is used, it's being fed immediately in the first part of the algorithm, which is where the first round occurs. Then it's fed through a substitution box and loaded to a register, which means at that point, it will leak some information to the attacker. If we capture a very large set of traces, for example, in the order of 50,000, then we can perform some signal processing on that. We can align those signals, feed them to a model, and again, apply a similar principle as with the fingerprinting example from before to extract the leakages that we saw in the previous slides. What we end up with is a set of encodings where each encoding essentially encodes the leakage value for a single byte. And on these encodings, we can perform a statistical analysis to obtain the secret key. Now, how does this differ with previous works? Well, in previous works, people use cross-entropy loss to optimize their machine learning algorithm. What we do instead is we optimize the correlation with the key leakage directly. What we also show is that our architecture allows to use a very shallow neural network as opposed to their work where a very deep convolutional neural network is used. So that means that we can perform this attack faster. And finally, we also use different input features, in this case, the frequency domain samples. Now let's take a look at this plot right here. In previous works, so the data set that we used for a benchmark contains 3 subsets. And for the previous work, they managed to find, for the easiest example, which is ASCII itself, managed to find the trace of the correct key in about 2,000 traces. For desynchronized traces, they managed to find a key in about 5,000 traces. And then for heavily desynchronized traces, they managed to find the correct key not at all. So they failed to find the correct key. In our work, we are able to find the key in each of those instances after about 1,000 traces, which is a significant improvement. Right, so I've told you now everything I wanted to tell you about the information leakages themselves. What can we conclude now from this work? Well, I've exposed several new protocol and implementation vulnerabilities in wireless communication. I published those results in 1 journal publication and 7 conference publications as the first author. And these works were then cited in 73 related works by other researchers. I also took great care to make sure that all my projects were open source so that other people can build on them and use the examples that I've shown you before. So this resulted in 15 open source projects and available data sets. In total, these projects amounted to amount of stars of 716 and 114 forks on GitHub. Now, the vulnerabilities that we saw can be categorized into explicit and implicit information leakages, where the explicit ones are due to protocol design and implementation flaws, but for those we proposed a number of fixes. For the implicit ones, what we did is we gained a better understanding of what the attacker can do with this data. Now, is the work done? Ending with my thesis? Yeah, of course not, because to provide security and privacy, we need to constantly adapt to new changes. For example, new protocols may be adapted in the future, new implementations will be created, and these may contain vulnerabilities. Furthermore, computation becomes cheaper for the adversary. The adversary can have more measurement equipment at its disposal in order to detect leakages. And furthermore, 0 days in existing systems will also still exist and be discovered in the future, which means that attackers are always 1 step ahead of the defenders. Now, why would this always be true? And to see why, I will leave you with this quote. It's easy to test how systems should behave, but not to test how systems could behave. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to take them.
De jury gaat nu over tot het stellen van vragen en omwille van de niet-Nederlandstalige leden van de jury zullen we dat in het Engels doen. So the questions will be conducted in English. And I would like to invite Professor Robyns to start with the questions. Please.
Thank you. It's I read the thesis and listening to the presentation. It's very nice. I'm very impressed by the quality of the thesis, the content, the depth and breadth of what you covered.
Thank you.
Especially the fact that you cover things from physical layer to network layer, and you do the analysis, introduce metrics, you also implemented systems that people use. So that's quite impressive. And as you were visiting us, I had several questions for you. So I don't have that many questions. My first one has to do with the MAC address fingerprinting and randomization. So you introduce these information theoretic metrics, variability and stability, and they were defined on a bit basis.
Yes.
So if you, but you can imagine that you can have patterns that span multiple bits. If you look at one bit at a time, it might look like the bit is not stable at all, but in fact, it could be that just these 2 bits, one that says 0, 0, these 2 bits, and then they can take value 0, 0 or 1, 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're very stable that way, but if you look at one of them at a time, they look not stable.
Yeah.
Do you see how you could extend your metrics to maybe cover these cases? Do you feel that there is a potential in there, or maybe it's not gonna, nobody really does anything like that?
Yeah, so what I believe is that the actual fingerprint uniqueness will not be impacted by this, because if those bits still change, you will still incorporate them into your fingerprint, of course. But what will happen is that you will have redundant bits, because if one bit is 0 and the other bits depend on it, then yeah, of course you will add them to your fingerprint as well. But what I was thinking to solve that issue is to essentially create some kind of encoding or mapping between those bits. So if you have, for example, 8 bits that always have the same value, you could encode that into 1 bit, right? Because they all contain the same value, which means that you can potentially reduce the size of your fingerprints. And I think that would be a possible improvement for future work, yes. Yeah.
And second question had to do with your investigation of packet in packet. So it's quite nice, but can you discuss a little bit overall is the limitations and the potential? So for instance, you can run it when you have, it has to be unencrypted open access point for you to.
Exactly.
So and you're able to achieve like things like first of all introducing like beacon framework, but also scanning network. Do you think there is any possibility, maybe it's not feasible, any possibility where you could track users? For instance, when someone is say target all the Starbucks and McDonald's, like you mentioned your thesis, and then you manage to send some frames that will, if you're specifically targeting one user, so that you get him to respond and say, well, he is at this Starbucks or that Starbucks. Is there any way that could be?
So I think it would depend on whether you know the MAC address of that user. Because if you do, you could in principle generate some kind of frame that elicits a response. But what I found to be the most difficult thing about these kind of attacks is that you also need to get a response back somehow over the internet. And I think this would be rather difficult to do because, like I said before, you need to know the MAC address of the device that you're going to track, which may or may not be realistic.
But let's say if you knew.
Okay, yeah. If you knew, well, still, I think it depends on the protocol. If you have a custom protocol, for example, that's given a certain UDP packet with a certain source port will respond to that packet, then I guess you could. But for example, for TCP, you need multiple messages being sent in order, so that would be very difficult to do for TCP. So I think it depends on the protocol.
Maybe some side channels.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the greatest impact from that work is from especially broadcast frames, because each Wi-Fi device accepts a message that is sent to the broadcast address will do parsing on this particular message. So that means if there is a driver vulnerability or firmware vulnerability, you can.
So you might be able to estimate how many people are in the Starbucks, which might be.
Yeah, but for example, for the host scan experiment that we did, where we sent ICMP ping packets, there were some access points that would let an echo reply pass through the firewall, but most modern access points wouldn't do that. So for determining how many people, this could be a problem. Yeah.
My last question, and just an open question, the electromagnetic correlation attacks and so on. So in terms of like future work and so on, we've done somewhere, you're visiting us, but like, can multi-antenna systems help if like possibilities of using like implants on devices to relay things so that you can really achieve this remotely and so on? Do you have any ideas on how you do in the future?
I do think that having multiple antennas will add some benefit for the attacker. Because, for example, when you have multiple antennas, you could estimate the angle, or you could capture data on different parts of the circuit, for example, at the same time. And especially in combination with those machine learning methods, I think that would be very promising. Because when I was at CHES this year, I noticed that all of the machine learning work was rather basic if you compare that to the computer vision domain, where they are a lot further ahead in terms of machine learning. So I think there is definitely a lot of potential in this domain for and especially with multiple antennas, because then you don't necessarily need to infer yourself what the implication is of placing multiple antennas somewhere. You can let machine learning algorithm try to find some more optimal solution for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Professor Ruby. We continue with Dr. Dwan.
So first of all, thank you for the nice presentation. I also enjoyed reading your thesis. But I also like is that you made a lot of things open source. Not many people do this. So I think it's a work you can be proud of. Of course, I have some questions as well. The first one is more general. You presented a few attacks, but you also discussed some defenses. But what one or two advices would you give to friends or family? How can they defend themselves?
Just throw your phone in the trash can. I think that especially for open Wi-Fi networks, there are so many vulnerabilities that have been around there for such a long time, and you know this as well. So especially when it goes about tracking people or just communicating over an open network, your data is just unencrypted. And still these networks are out there. If you look at airports, if you look at Starbucks, they all still have open networks because it's convenient, but convenience often has a trade-off with security. So my advice would be, even if you have to take a few extra steps to secure your network, just take them because it's really worth it if you would otherwise lose your data, because data is worth a lot these days. So that would be my recommendation.
Yes, so as you mentioned, using open networks, you advise not to do it, but of course, a lot of people still will do it. So do you think, how do you think users can still maybe use open networks while trying to secure itself? And how can maybe the industry itself improve the situation?
Yeah, there are a few initiatives like Passpoints or 802.11u, where you can still use encryption while operating on an open network. But yeah, for some reason, you still have to encourage people to really implement this. And this is also the responsibility of suppliers of those access points. So maybe it will also be good to try to contact, for example, Starbucks or McDonald's or any of those suppliers of open hotspots to stop using that and to encourage them to stop using those insecure technologies. Of course, then one issue that you could have is backwards compatibility. So then people might, if they have an older phone, they might not be able to connect anymore. So I think it's still a delicate issue in the end, because you have to make a sacrifice somewhere to obtain that.
Okay, one more question I have is with the Wi-Fi tracking, it's very clear what the risks are. And someone can track the places you visit. Some of these places can be very sensitive information. And you suggest a similar approach for LoRa devices, where you can fingerprint the devices and then track the devices. But what would be a real risk in practice of tracking a LoRa device? It's hard for me to imagine.
Yeah, so LoRa devices, they are also used, for example, if you have a delivery van, you could use LoRa devices to broadcast your location. And let's suppose that we have, I mean, this is a very contrived example, of course, but let's suppose that we have a LoRa device inside of a delivery van for tracking money. For example, if they go get money from a car, and you have some kind of encryption protocol that is supposed to be super secure, well, then still an attacker could use that to track those transmissions coming from that device. And you could do something like fox hunting, where you point an antenna in a certain direction and know, okay, this is the signal that I want to receive, and this is the device that is transmitting it. So I can try to track this device and try to find the money van, basically, and then try to break in. But of course, in practice, I think, it depends on the application again, because for temperature sensors, the impact would be relatively small. I agree with that, because if an attacker can find a temperature sensor, well, that's mostly those are stationary anyway. So then you could use something like fox hunting anyway. But yeah, it depends on the application.
Okay, maybe one last question. Against the Apple case, you exploited some interactions between EP protocols. Now there are a ton of EP protocols, so do you think there might be other things with new protocols if you use them together? Can go wrong? That's
what I was thinking about last week, actually, because I think it would be interesting to perform these kind of experiments again to see what has changed, because the experiments that I showed here were performed in 2014, and as you know, a lot of things change in technology over the years. So I think that might be interesting to look at some newer EAP methods as well, and perhaps whether some old vulnerabilities are reintroduced, which can also happen because we are also talking about some parts that are implementation specific.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Van Hoef. We continue with Professor Klaus.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this clear presentation. I also appreciated the manuscripts, and like Matthew, would like to thank you for all this software contributions. It's the first time I see so many repository on GitHub resulting from the PhD student. This is very impressive, and I might in the future use some of those software. So back on the packet injection, you mentioned encryption could be a solution. So I remember in the first work in this direction from Travis Goodspeed. So they had, limitations because they had scrambling. They had also to get the scrambling right. In your case, you don't have this limitation, which is good because you can, have pretty good performances. You said you can use encryption, but wouldn't it be also a good idea to have some artificial scrambling within the frame to?
That's a very good remark, because in fact, for packet-on-packet attacks, like you mentioned, there are some people that propose to use, for example, a different modulation scheme for the headers compared to the payloads. And when that's the case, then it can never happen that some data in the payloads will be interpreted as a header. And that's exactly what you want to do here, because one of the core issues is that if you have this certain payloads, then the modulation is the same as the headers. And this is what effectively allows you to inject the AMPDU delimiter, right? But if you use a different modulation scheme, unless they are somehow polyglots, then you can not create a valid header frame, and this will then indeed stop an attack. But what would be required is that, you actually need hardware changes to accomplish this. And I don't know if vendors are prepared to do all of this stuff to mitigate this vulnerability. So because it would involve replacing all hardware, there might also be, I think there will be compatibility issues with previous Wi-Fi devices. So it's definitely not trivial to do something like that. And that's why I opted for the encryption, because that's very easy to implement.
Going to the tracking issue, you mentioned randomizing the address while probing. You said that we also want to be protected when we are connected. And you said that we should use randomization while connected.
Yeah.
But as far as I understand, when you are connected, you cannot change your address.
That's true.
As you wish. So what do you think we should do?
So I think what you could do to, as a kind of middle ground, is to, for one service set, so for one network name, you just use a random MAC address and you keep using that address for that network name. So in that case, the attacker could still, if they know this configuration, they could still spoof multiple access points with that network name, but then the attacker has to know the SSD of that network. So that would make it a little bit harder. But yeah, that's true. There is a downside to randomizing even when connecting. Yeah.
So the first part, I think, is about, the root cause is the standards that are behind, and we saw there were many flaws in there. So what do you think should be done in order to improve the standards and maybe improve the process in which they are created?
I think if I could answer that question right now in one go, then it would mean that would be a very simple problem, but it's not a very simple problem because there are so many components in a system that can work together, and there could be so many vulnerabilities. For example, when instigating frames, you just send a random message from the standard and suddenly you have another transmission from a device. So it depends on the standard, but also the implementation. And so there are many factors to consider. So I don't think I can, off the top of my head, come up with a solution that is right for every device there is. So that's a very difficult question to answer. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we have so many problems with Wi-Fi.
one last question, the tough one. So you, during part of your research was based on some data sets that have been collected in the wild. I've done the same thing.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, what do you think about ethical and legal issues associated to that? And you are doing this, I mean, for the good of in the public interest. So what are your thoughts about this issue?
Well, first and foremost, we have the ethical research committee, which always has to give us approval to do these kind of experiments. And for example, for the MAC address tracking, I had to convince these people that I would not capture any data from children, because apparently children are very crucial in law to avoid. But because the MAC address reveals not many information about a person themselves, so based on the MAC address, you cannot really identify whether someone is a child or not. So I think in terms of this kind of tracking, the ethical issues are, I mean, they're there, but they're not as severe as, for example, for medical studies, where you need volunteers that tell something about their health, and this data gets stored about a certain person. So I do think there is a distinction between ethical considerations for devices versus persons. And even if you know that a certain device is transmitting, you still need to do some extra work to couple it to one person. And that's why I think, yeah, this issue is less serious.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Professor Kaas. Dr. Singele.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, I have to repeat with what the other three members mentioned. Also, congratulations with the text. It was very impressive. Also, your presentation, I think you very clearly explained all the things you did.
I did my best.
That's not so easy to do. So, but I also still have a few questions. First of all, I want to start with the LoRa fingerprinting.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, so you use machine learning, what other people in the fingerprinting, on physical layer fingerprinting didn't do until now. But could you use the same methodology on other wireless standards, like on Wi-Fi or something?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so each standard should provide some guidelines on which error tolerances are accepted. So for LoRa, it turns out that these error tolerances are quite large. So even if you have a lot of frequency offset, you can still correctly receive messages. But for Wi-Fi, I don't know specifically for Wi-Fi what the tolerances are, but I can imagine that there is also some margin in terms of how many errors a certain signal can contain. And I think that if you have differences between those errors between devices, as long as that is the case, you can do fingerprinting. Yes.
And I was just about that deep, but since you're doing fingerprinting on physical layer and on MAC layer, would it be an advantage to combine both, because you have sort of your MAC layer?
Yeah, I think that
anyhow, and you have your physical layer fingerprinting.
I think that would be a very good idea, and I don't know if there are a lot of works that do that already. But yeah, by combining the MAC layer leakages and MAC layer, so physical and MAC layer leakages, indeed you have more information, and more information for the attacker is always better to fingerprint devices. So yes, I do think that this could work.
Bit more detailed question. So for the LoRa fingerprinting, machine learning typically needs some data, but typically LoRa devices, they only are typically, most use cases, they just send a few packets per hour or something, it's like a temperature reading or so on. Isn't this conflicting with the machine learning?
Yeah, actually, yeah, in some way it does. But that's why I decided to look into zero-shot learning, which is a part that is not discussed in the presentation. But what this means is that if you, as an attacker, you have access to as many devices as you want. So if you would take a very large pool of devices, learn which features are important for distinguishing them, and then apply zero-shot learning, which doesn't require any external training data, then you could still be able to fingerprint those devices. Because if you then learn a certain feature space, you know, okay, these features of the signal are important, and you get a new signal, you can use that to identify it as a new class. And if you compare that to, this is actually what we humans also do if we have expert knowledge about a protocol. So if you measure the frequency error by hand, you don't need to do any machine learning. You can just extract the feature called frequency offset. You can calculate it for a single symbol, and then when you have multiple devices, you can start comparing them with each other. So yeah, I don't think that would be a practical issue. if you have access to LoRa devices yourself.
And then maybe a last one, a bit more philosophical question. So this information leakage, as you already mentioned, it's always there.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for side channel attacks, what typically people do to prevent it is sort of distribute your sensitive information.
Yeah.
And that you mentioned in one of the previous questions that indeed if you have multiple antennas, you can measure on multiple places on your chip, but that's sort of a countermeasure that people typically go, sort of distribute it and assume that the attacker is not able to measure everything at the same time. But then if you look at those things like more physical layer fingerprinting there, it's probably more difficult to do something like this. So is it really a lost cause, as you say, fingerprinting is impossible to ever solve this issue?
I think it's not impossible, but I think we need to employ a similar strategy as what is done in side channel analysis, where you just try to make it as difficult as possible for the attacker, or maybe you can make it so that the attacker has such a high error rate that it becomes infeasible to do fingerprinting. But yeah, I do think that you need changes in the hardware to effectuate this. Yeah.
So just as follow-up, so it would mean that you would make the hardware a bit less reliable or something, or whatever?
Rather more reliable, because if it's more reliable, then more fingerprints from devices will overlap, so the clusters will be closer together, and it will become harder for attackers to distinguish between the individual symbols. But this would unfortunately also probably increase the cost, because I think one of the reasons why LoRa is so cheap is because it has such a high error tolerance, so you can use cheap hardware for those devices, and then that also has a security or privacy cost in the end. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singele. Professor Luiten.
Thank you for your presentation and for your nice text. It's impressive the depth you went in and the number of techniques you combined. I assume that using machine learning and physical signals, that requires some perseverance to get things done.
That's true.
It's quite hard. I'll try to ask some questions. This is not my domain of expertise, so some might be more high level, some might be a bit out of the direct scope.
That's okay.
One of the impressions I got while reading your text is that maybe there's not such a big difference between implicit leakage and explicit leakage. In the end, isn't all leakage actually explicit? Because you would assume that the protocol designer also has a responsibility over the implicit leakage, what you call implicit leakage.
So how I see it is that the explicit leakages that I discussed can always be solved by changing something in the protocol itself, whereas for the implicit leakages, they are always present. For example, if you look at a radio signal, you can never create two devices that have exactly the same physical properties as one another. So if you create two identical devices, there might be some, for example, if you have a crystal oscillator, it might be that one crystal oscillator is just a little bit faster than the other one. And so that's why I call these implicit, because it's really hard to prevent them. And if you have better measurement equipment, you can always measure some difference between two devices. And that's why they are implicit.
Well, I like that answer because that's the same direction I was thinking in, but that also assumes that you don't have to take that into account in the protocol itself. While it might be a good idea to take that into account, and you actually already gave some solutions for that. You use machine learning to detect these issues. Right? Would it be a kind of solution to set up some kind of benchmark for protocol designers with different kinds of machine learning techniques, and say, if you want to create a protocol that works in this area, these are things you have to test. This is a benchmark you have to pass first.
Yeah, I think you could do that, but then in the end, I think it's difficult to determine, because what if the attacker uses another architecture for his machine learning model, for example? Maybe there are better ways to extract the features than what I did. So I don't think it really gives you any guarantees that there will be no attack. So again, and the reason is because you have, implicit leakage is always there. So yeah, it depends on what the attacker can do. If the attacker has more, for example, like we discussed before, more measurement probes, maybe he can extract more information, and then your benchmark will be worthless because you're still vulnerable. So, but what benchmarks could be used for is perhaps say something like, okay, you are certified against an attacker that has these and these and these properties, and get a certification for that. But yeah, then there would probably be a lot of different certifications if you would do something like that.
Again, great answer, because that brings me to the next question. You also have to choose which machine learning techniques that you use. And there might be a big difference between which technique you use, where you find something, you don't find something. What was your reference framework for selecting an appropriate algorithm? Did you have was it like a Pareto optimal principle that you used, or did you try to have equivalent algorithms working? How did you do that?
That's a very good question, because I think they are facing the same issue in the domain of computer vision.
Yeah.
You start with a certain algorithm, it works, but maybe somebody can find a better loss function, a better architecture that in these scenarios works better. So this is what's called the no free lunch theorem. So I do think that's a very difficult problem to determine what exactly an attacker can do. And that's why I also think that this domain is very exciting for the future, because there could be some techniques out there that allow you to, based on a few electromagnetic traces, extract the key, for example, but maybe we just don't know about them yet. And that's what makes this kind of research so interesting to me.
I would assume that we would like to limit ourselves to interpretable machine learning techniques, so that we can actually understand why it finds something. Because in this case, with your techniques, it's very hard to understand what's the cause. You know there's a vulnerability, there's something wrong. But I guess with algorithms you use, it's very hard to decipher them, to understand why they came up.
Yeah, that's a valid point, but there are a lot of techniques that you can already use to find the cause. For example, if you look at saliency, which is used to find which features cause a certain change in your feature space. So if you would, for example, apply saliency methods to the example for AES encryption, you would see a peak at the first round, because that's where the samples are that contribute to this leakage for the key. So I do think there are some methods to check what it is learning, but yeah, there's still work being done on that as well in the computer vision domain. So it's yeah, something for future work, maybe, that we can distinguish better what causes the leakage in this way. Yeah.
Do you think machine learning would also be a solution for the code you have on there? Would you be able to model an attacker and try to, have algorithms that try to generate lots of different ways to attack something? Or?
I don't think so, because the set of possible outcomes or inputs that you can give to a program is so large that I'm not sure how you would train your machine learning algorithm to detect this. But yeah, who knows, maybe somebody will discover something in the future that can magically solve all security problems using machine learning. But I would be very interested in reading that paper.
Another question out of curiosity: what of your observations, or based on what happens in the physical domain, radio waves, electricity going on, and you also mentioned that the change in temperature also did something with the data you collected. Is there something we could do? Could we have an automatic thermostat or some other devices start to generate the magnetic fields in our houses to help us to protect against attacks?
I think, if you mean for tracking, I think there are some works that do something similar, where they try to influence how the hardware behaves. But yeah, I'm not familiar with this work in particular. So, but I do think that it's possible to do that. The question is, to what degree does this work in practice? So,
did you try to do some things like that?
No.
Try to variate temperature?
No, not deliberately, no.
Like moving objects in the surroundings, those kind of things?
The only thing we did for LoRa was capture signals from a further distance. But yeah, so temperature, we didn't play with that. I suppose you also need a very controlled environment for that if you want to measure that in a scientific way. So, which may or may not be easy, because the air conditioning here may fluctuate some degrees. And
or a very precise model to do the simulation, that's probably also very hard to do. Then my last question is not really a question. A lot of things you said was, and also the question, what can a user do? And you also mentioned one app that you could install.
Yeah, that was one example for that case. Yeah.
But then there's an issue. This app works above the operating system level, and you're never, as a user, you're never really sure that the operating system does what you want it to do. Like in the iPhone, you can also turn off Wi-Fi for a while, but it's not sure that it's really turned off.
That's true, but that's why we have security researchers to see if you disable the Wi-Fi, whether it's actually disabled. And I think that if a vendor would risk sending data through a covert channel, I think they would be shamed publicly pretty fast if someone discovers it. So I don't think that many companies will try to do this, but I could be wrong, especially if you buy a Chinese product, for example.
But I do think that there is also a user interface, a user design issue to play here. That if you look at the network settings, the way they're exposed to the user, the way they're explained, it's all quite obfuscated, especially for me. It's really hard to know what the impact is of a change you make in those settings. And those settings are there for end users, not for security researchers.
Mm-hmm.
They're there for end users. So it seems that lots of vendors actually on purpose use very hard to decipher terminology, very hard interfaces to enable you to take control of your network. There's more accountability in the vendors to expose more of the details and to explain us what the impact is if you make a change.
Yeah, but then maybe it becomes too complicated for the user to understand. So that's something that maybe can also happen. But it's not only the users, because if I saw a paper a few years ago that was about how certain Android permissions, if you set them for your app, they can break through and exploit some or read some things that they shouldn't be able to read because of flaws in the operating system. So I think that's a similar issue here where, yeah, there could be some information leaks because of the vendor doing something wrong, essentially, and that's why security research is so important.
I think there's lots to gain if we can solve those issues.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Luiten. Then we come to the co-advisor, Professor Quacks.
Thank you, Pieter. It was a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
You improved quite a lot from last meeting. So we had lots of discussions before, so I won't go into any technical details, but more on a high level. I think the most important question hasn't been asked yet: should you buy an Android phone or an iPhone?
Well, considering the last time I did protocol security is a few years ago, I would say I don't know, because there could be some new vulnerabilities in Android phones right now, or new vulnerabilities in Apple phones. So yeah, I think this is a very hard thing to determine in advance. And if I would say something and somebody finds a vulnerability next week in Android, then I have a problem. So to wisely abstain from that question.
So I'm going to just make a statement. It's not my personal opinion, but it would be a statement from, let's say, a layperson in the audience. I could say that the majority of the impact of security is on the application layer, right? Most people are familiar with attacks like phishing or ransomware attacks, and those have the most exposure in the wild. So there is lots of issues also on the network security side, as you exposed here, but little is really known about any practical outbreaks of them, right? It's not like in the news every day that an outbreak of that type happens.
Do you mean on the lower layers, or?
Yeah, like on the physical layer or the network protocol layer, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, we are exposed literally every day with outbreaks of ransomware or phishing attacks.
Yeah.
So is it still worthwhile to investigate? And why do you think that it is rarely in the news that an attack happens, exploiting these kinds of problems on the physical layer? Or
I think the reason is that those vulnerabilities for the lower layers require a lot of expertise to find them, and that's why we see less of them, whereas for ransomware, you don't need to have a lot of knowledge to create an application that encrypts files. So yeah, I think for lower layers, it's just more difficult to find.
Maybe not worthwhile for the attacker to invest the time and effort to launch such kind of attack.
On the other hand, if you, for example, find a vulnerability that is in hardware, you can't patch hardware devices if it's baked in the circuit. So then you have a larger reward.
Like Intel, for example.
Yeah, and so if you look at, for example, Spectre and Meltdown, if you discover something like this, then you have a major vulnerability that you discovered. And yeah, so I think the impact can be higher because we know how to deal with ransomware. But for those unknown vulnerabilities, that's a lot harder to counter that. And so they could be exploited more efficiently by attackers if they are discovered.
Yeah. But it does not seem to happen that often, right? Even with Spectre and Meltdown, we see very few practical attacks.
Yeah, but how do you know that this didn't happen. Maybe somebody just earned $1 million by exploiting this spectrum meltdown attack, but yeah.
Okay. And then, just the final question that I had is that radio signals are hard to contain, right? So they emanate from an access point and they go into this room and all go just next door, so it's hard to contain them. Unless you line all the walls with that.
Yeah.
To kind of counteract them, some researchers have looked into, for example, like Wi-Fi, using visible light as a means to convey radiation signals in this case.
Yeah.
So could this type of technology help, you think, in terms of security? So that would maybe help against eavesdropping? But is it then a more secure method of trying to relay information?
I do think that would help because by changing properties of the signal, you change the permeability, for example, and light cannot pass through walls, of course. So that definitely limits the capabilities of the adversary. But then probably there are also some practical issues because how do you then communicate? You can't, if you have a phone with Wi-Fi, then you have to point your phone towards the receiver or something. Then, I mean, I think then you have some usability issues. Because for Wi-Fi, it's very convenient because you can, I mean, walk around and it doesn't matter where this radiation comes from. Whereas for millimeter wave networks, it becomes already dodgy. And then for lights, I suppose, yeah, that's would be, in terms of usability, would be difficult to.
But if you go to like the 5G paradigm where we use millimeter wave transmissions for high transmissions, would then the number of questions that you like exposed or pose yourself, would they be resolved automatically or not?
What do you mean exactly?
Well, some things are really dependent on you being able to capture the data, right? As an attacker. And that might not be possible if the, let's say the range of the radiation is limited in itself.
Yeah, I do think that's true. So depending on the signal properties, there might be different adversarial models that we have to consider. So yeah, I think that could help, but the question is, does it fully prevent the attacker from doing anything? But that would anyway require more research. So I don't know.
Questions? Thank you, Mr. Correction. We come to the advisor, Professor Lamotte.
I have, of course, no more questions about your work, but one question was triggered by one of your answers. Since when do we have air conditioning at the end?
I have air conditioning at my I have the mobile air conditioning, so.
I think we should rethink the hierarchy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lamotte. Are there questions from the audience? Zijn er vragen uit het publiek? In my handen now. Well, I also wanted to ask the most pressing question of all, but Pieter was already ahead of me, so even though your answer was a little bit avoiding, I will not come back to it. So, dat beslaat dan de publieke verdediging van uw proefschrift. De jury zal zich nu terugtrekken voor beraadslaging en ik verzoek u samen met uw gezelschap hier het resultaat ervan af te wachten.
Okay.
Nou, Pieter.
Deze commissie, belast door de rector van de Transnationale Universiteit Limburg, met het toekennen van de graad van dokter in de wetenschappen in informatica, heeft vastgesteld dat Pieter Jules Robyns voldoet aan de voorwaarden gesteld door de Doctoral School of Sciences and Technology, heeft gehoord de openbare verdediging van het proefschrift van Pieter Jules Robyns, getiteld Explicit and Implicit Information Leakage in Wireless Communication, heeft vervolgens beraadslaagd en heeft na beraadslaging beslist aan Pieter Jules Robyns toe te kennen de graad van dokter in de wetenschappen in informatica, en dit met de bijzondere felicitaties van de commissie. Proficiat.
Dank u.
Hiermee is het officiële deel van de zitting gesloten. U mag gaan zitten. Maar de traditie wil dat de promotor, mede namens de co-promotor, die natuurlijk ook deelde in deze felicitaties, een woordje richt tot onze nieuwe dokter.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter.